Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on environmentalists as activists. And I'd be very pleased to welcome our panel to join me on stage. And I can see we'll have just a few more people streaming in as we get going. But it's great to have this session coming up where we are going to be exploring some of the lines that we tread as professionals working in the environmental sector and as passionate people really interested working in our areas and looking to push and to make change and positive change in the world, often as activists as well. And so we've got a fantastic panel lined up to discuss this topic, and I'm sure it's something that will resonate with a lot of people in the room. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves with a quick provocation, maybe talking a little bit about how their day jobs and then also how that links in with some of their personal activist activities as well. So we haven't actually discussed a running order, but what I might do is start with just in the order that you appear on my screen at least, and start with Laura, if that's okay. Oh, Laura, you're muted. Well, we will, whilst we see if Laura can get the unmuted as well. Why don't we start with Colin in that case?
Okay, thanks, Matt. Yeah, thanks for the invitation to speak here. I think it's really fitting that the Communicate conference has a session on activism, because ultimately activism is a form of communication. It's about trying to get people to listen to one's message and hopefully to act on it. And communication is an important part of my job. I'm a professor of psychology at University of Bristol, so I'm involved in communicating science not only to students but also to other scientists. But also, because my research is in the field of psychology, there is some extra scope potentially for linking the personal and the professional, because I think there is a lot of psychology in the crafting of messages and in trying to understand why those messages do or don't have an impact on people's beliefs and behavior. At the same time, though, I think there's a trap that one can easily fall into here, because it's possible to fool yourself into thinking that if there is some overlap between what you do in your professional life and the particular causes that you're interested in promoting, that therefore it follows that these two things are pointing in the same direction, and that you are cleverly using your professional skills to advance that cause. I think that can be a particular danger for psychologists like me, but perhaps also a danger more generally for professional communicators. So as a way of thinking about this, I'd like to explore an analogy, a kind of provocation, if you like, that has been on my mind lately. And it's one that was proposed just this week by the broadcaster James O'Brien, when he was reflecting on recent protests that just started this week, in which members of Insulate Britain have been blocking the M25 to publicise their demand. And thinking about that, O'Brien asked us to consider a bus that's heading towards the edge of a cliff. And most of the passengers are aware, of course, that that's a problem. But there are a couple of passengers who are really quite upset about it. And they're screaming at everyone, saying, "We've got to stop the bus." But that's very annoying for their fellow passengers. And of course, we can sympathise with those passengers. At the same time, O'Brien suggests that nevertheless, the people who are screaming are, in fact, right. Now, I think that's a nice analogy for climate activism. It doesn't necessarily win you friends. But then I would say that, as someone whose sympathies tend to lie with the activists. At the same time, I think there are some important elements that are missing from this analogy, and we need to include those elements if we're going to have a better understanding of the situation and of what we can contribute as communicators. So while it captures some important truths about our current situation, I think the bus analogy is silent about what perhaps is the most important question, which is, why is the bus hurtling towards the edge? And one way you might answer this question is to suggest that maybe the driver is unaware of the predicament. Maybe they're unaware of the problem altogether, or of how serious it is, or how urgent, or how short-sighted it would be to rely on the hope of some future technology fixing the problem. And if you take that perspective, the problem seems pretty simple. It's just a matter of providing the necessary information to the driver, or whoever has the power to influence the driver. And that way of thinking is, of course, called the information deficit account. But we know by now that a lack of information isn't really the problem. It's important to provide good quality information to the public and to decision makers and to counter misinformation. But ultimately, that's not where the problem lies. We have all the information that we need to stop the bus, and there is something else going on here. So another tempting way to answer the question then is to suggest that the problem lies in human psychology. So you might say that we are unable to respond to risks in the future because we engage in temporal discounting, or we're vulnerable to an optimism bias which makes us downplay the risks, or maybe the threat of climate change is so scary that we engage in denial, and so on. This is a sample of some of the so-called psychological barriers that might lead to inaction. And for psychologists like me, I think this way of thinking offers the possibility that maybe we could get to the bottom of this fatal flaw in the human psyche, and that might allow us to figure out how to circumvent it and how to design messages that work more effectively. But while that's an appealing notion, I think actually it's an illusion, which is not to say that there's not some interesting psychology at work here, but I would argue that these psychological mechanisms are largely a response to the situation rather than the cause of it. Because ultimately, I think the reason the bus is hurtling towards the cliff edge is that there are some very powerful actors in this situation that are making a lot of money out of it, and who will make much less money if the driver takes their foot off the gas. And it's easy to say, well, that's the system we have, but the system doesn't have to stay this way. And it will ultimately change. It's just that that change is being held back by oil and gas companies. So for me then, as an activist who's also a communicator and a psychologist, the most important questions are about how we tell that story and how social movements can find the right balance between getting people's attention and getting people's support. And is it possible even to get both of those things? And if not, which do we prioritize, attention or approval? Now, some people might see the situation differently from me, and that's fine, of course. But I would like to urge everyone who wants to combine their professional communication skills with activism to think about what is the best way to do that. It's said that for someone with a hammer, every problem resembles a nail. And I think for a communicator, it's natural that we attempt to solve problems by providing information or by telling a story, but we need to be clever about that and make sure that we're telling the right story.
Fab. Thank you so much, Colin. That's a great provocation to get us started with. And as our speakers come in, then do please feel free to drop your comments and thoughts in the chat, because we'll be coming back around to those, and also if you have a more direct question, then straight in the Q&A section there as well. I'm going to circle back around to you, Laura, but I wanted to bring in Zarina next into do her provocation as well. So Zarina, would you like to take it away?
Thanks, Matt. I'm probably going to take this to probably a very personal level about what activism means to me, because I've had a very probably personal, interesting journey for myself, because I don't relate to as being an activist. I never have related to being an activist. It was a bit of a shock to me and a shock to my system when someone labeled me as an activist. I was like, hold it. I'm not one of those activists, right? So that was going back probably about 10 years ago. I had gone along to a meeting, and it was just, and I was an environmentalist. So I probably labeled myself as an environmentalist or a community worker. And I'd gone along just to a workshop on community growing, community gardening, right? And it was to discussing climate change and how we can do this through encouraging people to grow more and grow locally and set up community gardens, etc., etc. And then after this meeting, as the meeting was coming to an end, there was this march and this rally in George Square in Glasgow. And everybody in the room was like getting together to say, right, come on, we need to go to this rally and this march. And I'm like saying, well, what's this march and this rally for? And they goes, well, you know, we're all activists. We need to be out there. We need to be showing our support and our voice. And that was when I went, whoa, 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 not for me. I'm not one of you. I'm not an activist. I'm not one of these people that are going to be standing on bridges and marching and, you know, having like, you know, banners up and protesting. And, you know, it just wasn't the space for me. It just didn't make me feel comfortable being in that space. Now, for many reasons, it probably didn't make me feel comfortable. So I'm obviously a person of colour, and I grew up in the 70s. And in the 70s, I grew up in the northeast of England. In the 70s, we had things like the National Front, like we, as in Britain, had the National Front. So it was very much a very overt racist society I lived in. And you had to run for your life many of the times. And I really mean you had to run for your life. Otherwise, you would get beaten up. And you know, it was, you could get killed. And nobody would bat an eyelid, right? And I'll give you an example of that. So we had Paki Bashan Day, right? And when I tell this story to like my children now, they're absolutely horrified. So Paki Bashan Day was at the end of term, at the end of the summer term, the bell would ring, right? And at that point, if you were somebody of colour, you had to run for your life, right? If you did not, you would get absolutely beaten up. And because it happened on school grounds, after the bell had gone at the end of term, the teachers would walk away from it and say it's got nothing to do with us. The police would say it's got nothing to do with them because it was on school grounds. Now I'm talking about 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old children, right? And so this is the type of racism I grew up with. So getting into trouble with the police in any way or form was just not in our dictionary. It was just not something that you do. Don't make yourself vulnerable in any way. So being an activist and rallying or marches or demos where you're vulnerable was just something that you just don't go there. So that was probably when I used to recoil in that term of an activist, because it was my own perception of what an activist was. It was only later, as I started to do the work that I do, that I realized that there was many forms of activism. And now I feel a little bit more comfortable, but however, I still struggle attaching that label to myself. I feel as if I'm more about engaging and inspiring others to do more, right? And I take a back seat. I'm like the driver from behind pushing people to do things. And that may be because I'm a bit of a coward and I don't want to be on the front line. I don't want to be out there voicing myself and holding myself accountable in any form or shape. So maybe because I do feel vulnerable. And so my job has been for the last 10 to 12 years is about connecting racial justice with climate justice. And so I bring two injustices to the forefront. So again, it's very important that people's voices get heard, people that are marginalized, people whose voices don't normally get heard, and in spaces where they would not normally get heard. And for me, a lot of the work that I've had to do is to think about alternative ways for activism to happen and what that could look like. So whether that is having discussions with your local MSPs, having even discussions within your own communities around issues such as climate change that are important, having discussions with think tanks, having discussions with NGOs, having discussions with other activists and thinking about how other people can get involved. And then there's and sometimes I say that many of us are backseat drivers or backseat activists in terms of happy to sign a petition, happy to share things on social media. And I still think that's okay. And that's still an activist. That's still one form of activism. For me, the most important thing is to still be doing something rather than doing nothing. And I think that's really important. With my day job, how I've struggled in my day job, even though I've been working on racial justice and climate justice in my employment, the organization I worked for was funded through government funding. So again, that capped the amount of activity that I could actually do, because you can do things within communities, you can do things with other NGOs, but as soon as you stand above the parapet and start challenging the government, it was like, hold back, you're not allowed to do that. So that's where I struggled. And because of that struggle, I actually had to leave my job. And just because it was a personal conflict, that the job I was so passionate about meant that I had to challenge the powers above, whether it's political powers, corporate powers. It just meant then I wasn't the right space for me to be in. And now I'm doing a PhD because of the lack of research with people of colour, and again because I love the work I was doing, and I've been working in this field for 10 years, and it was as if that work had just gone up into ether. Nobody knew about it. Even now when I have discussions with people and say, well, what are people of colour doing? What are ethnic minorities doing around climate change? Where are these environmental activists? And there are many of them. It's just that they're hidden, they're not recorded, they're not given the platform, and I'm hopefully trying to push the doors open for more environmental activists, people of colour, to come forward.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Serena, as well, and thanks for sharing those stories as well, that I'm sure resonate with many people in the audience as well. We will circle that back around now to Laura, and hopefully we've got a microphone working.
Yeah, hopefully it's working.
Yes, perfect.
Fantastic. Okay. So yeah, thank you very much for those stories, and I'm going to also tell a personal story. So I grew up firstly in a lower middle class, upper working class background, so very kind of Daily Mail territory. First in the family to university, always been a good girl. So I also kind of struggled with activism or doing kind of naughty things, and probably at first thought of people as kind of those crusties, they should get a job. This was kind of 20, 30 years ago, So I did get a job, and my job was one that aligned with my values. So I wanted to communicate about the environment, and that's what I did. So I worked, I first of all did environmental projects, then I worked as a journalist, and then moved into research. So all the time, very much as Colin said, that information deficit model. So thinking if we just tell people a bit more about the problems, surely they'll rationally change really soon. And of course, in my years of lecturing, each year I had to update my slides, and each year the hottest year changed to kind of the one before. And during the sort of the 2010s, that got very depressing. Where every year, it was this year is the hottest year, etc. I remember with the 2015 Paris Agreement, lecturing my environmental science students, and I really felt hope then. Finally, policymakers are going to take action. They've realised it's going to be okay. And even so, the students even then were depressed and anxious about kind of what's going to happen with the future and so on. But we thought there'd be hope. Then not much changed. Then 2018, the IPCC report. And that was the moment for me where I realised, as the other speakers have said, there are vested interests in keeping the bus going, so keeping society as it is. And what I was doing in my day job wasn't enough. And by then I had 2 children as well, so one of whom turns 18 in 2030. Which was the report's thing that we have 12 years left to kind of make a difference. Of course, that's been updated recently as well with Code Red for Humanity. We're way not on course whatsoever, and we seriously need to take action. So 2018 was a wake-up call, and that was the birth of Extinction Rebellion as well. And I remember seeing the activists and thinking, someone finally feels like me, and it gave me hope. So 2019, I took part in some Extinction Rebellion protests, merely as a sitter in the road person rather than a chaining on person. So I've never been arrested. And for me, that feels kind of a step too far. They talk about, are you arrestable? And I would say I'm not arrestable to keep in my job. But again, you know, I came home, and I live in a sort of a suburban community, and the Facebook comments were like how you may have seen in the media about these activists and so on. And I just, it was a wake-up call for me that how, if I can't even communicate with my own community, how can I be teaching about communication skills to other people? And it led me to set up a community climate action group. And from there, I've just taken on role after role in activism and steering groups and things, lobbying, policy, kind of working with our local council and so on. We got the local council, well, there was several groups who got the council to declare a climate emergency, as many have done. And then we, our group, we formed, we became constituted, and we've since become part of the South Gloucestershire Climate Emergency Forum. We're also a Friends of the Earth Action Group, and are now linked to activists across the west of England, where we're just really trying to hold policymakers to account. So for me, it is a fine line to walk of still being acceptable and responsible enough to be in the day job, to be lecturing and talking to people, applying psychology as Colin does as well, but also still being an activist in all the ways that are legal, to really push and make a difference. And I think one of the key things for me is just conversations in the community and knowing your community and what values they have. So thinking about climate outreaches, Project Britain Talks Climate, our community is probably civic pragmatists and loyal nationals. So it's finding things that chime with those values to get them to come to events and get them to care about nature, as we've heard about in the conference, and aligning nature with climate action as well. So protecting in balance with our environment and our green and pleasant land and so on. But it's still an interesting line to walk, to push as hard as you can whilst still staying within society, if you like, as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for those provocations. And whilst I let our audience kind of digest some of that, and please do put in your own kind of questions, provocations, and share your own stories if you are happy and comfortable doing that in the chat function and the Q&A on the right-hand side of your screens as well. But I was just sort of interesting in some of the something that was touched upon by all three of you as well, and maybe is a useful sort of startup for a bit of conversation between the panel. I suppose there's kind of three things that really flagged up in there for me that were shared, of both the kind of the conflicts of interest between the kind of the day job, the professional aspirations, and versus that kind of conscience and passion for and activism. And I suppose related to that is around stigma and the social stigma that then comes with Zarina, particularly, you know, that label of activism and kind of riling against that terminology. And then the third thing that I'll just ask you to respond to as well is thinking about some of the privilege bias that comes in as well in terms of time, you know, so much of this being on a voluntary basis and outside of work as well. And I wonder whether those would be sort of three things that would be little prompts for a bit more conversation. So I don't know if anyone wants to kind of volunteer to come forward first on any of those points.
Serena, maybe? No? Maybe sort of talking about that. So we were talking earlier. So I very much, so my community are the people who, you know, are really rude about activists and crusties and mung bean eating, bivouac wearing and so on. So they sort of it is trying to reduce the stigma around activism and being different. I think that's one of the things. They really want to be normal, and anything that's outside of that normal, they don't like. And I think that's definitely what politicians, people, and so that's what they do, is they try to other activists or people who want to make a change. We had an interesting conversation about this, about how do you other people? Well, you reduce their credibility. And I know that, I mean, maybe Colin, you could tell your story of how you tried to reduce that. And of course, it relates to Zarina as well because of the racial issues around that, the privilege of that.
Sure, yeah. I think you're referring to kind of a costume that I have sometimes worn at protests, which is to wear a suit. I call it a costume because, you know, my job doesn't actually entail me wearing a suit. I mean, maybe at job interviews. But I felt that it was an interesting way to try and challenge people's stereotypes of what an activist looks like, and to encourage those people who are suit wearers and perhaps in positions of power to reflect a bit more about how, you know, maybe there are people like them who might share similar concerns. I mean, one thing I'd like to come back to is this unease that people have with labels, which I can relate to, although in my case, I feel it's a bit different. So I feel a slight unease with being labeled an environmentalist. And not because I don't care about the environment, but just because I'm always a little bit suspicious of that label, and I worry that there's something about it which encourages people to think about the environment as something out there, something separate, which maybe is part of the problem that we have. Whereas I don't feel the same concern about being labeled an activist. It's not that I have always identified as an activist, although, you know, if I think back on my life, I think I've always been a bit of a troublemaker, which maybe is one of the things that you need to be an activist. But I mean, on this question about, do you care whether or not people like you? I mean, if you talk to activists, or at least the kind of people who block roads, say, then what they will always say is it doesn't matter whether or not people like us. We are raising awareness, getting people to talk about these issues. Now, the big question is, are they right about that? And you know, I'm trying to do some research about this as well. I mean, what impact it has when activists engage in more, you know, extreme behavior. Yes, we know that makes people a bit more suspicious of the activists. They might regard them as immoral. It doesn't seem to reduce people's support for the cause, nor does it necessarily shift it in favor of the cause. So I guess the question is, if you do that, are you able then to get people talking about the issue rather than talking about you?
I don't know if I agree with that. Right. Right. Okay. So labeling, I think, has a huge issue. I agree with you totally. Right. But however, for many people, the label is put on them. And that again goes back to what Laura was saying about the othering. Right. And that's where I think the groups and the communities I work with who are in positions of power and privilege, right? It's because the labels are put on them. The activism is what they are told to do. It's not from them. It's from somebody else telling them what to do. And again, with communicators, climate change communicators, it's very much about a top-down approach. We are going to tell you what to do. We are going to tell you what you need to understand. We are going to tell you what is important. Now, however, many of the people that I work with have connections to other parts of the world, right? So for them, climate change is real, was real, has always been real, right? The impacts of climate change has been devastating for them, their families, their home life. Many of them have been displaced by climate change. And what I would like to do is really in that communications kind of area is try to change it and flip it the way we think about climate change communication. Is actually try to build up the knowledge, the cultural knowledge, and try to extract some of that out and try to build on what is already known. What is that inherent climate change knowledge that is embedded in communities? And I think that's where we should be starting from, rather than the top-down approach. So sometimes I struggle with the way communicators talk about climate change and how it's like presented to many communities. And I also think it's not one way. Different communities, like horses for courses. We have to be flexible in the approaches that we take. And again, I think Laura was like saying that, she was alluding to that depending on who you're talking to, you will change your tone, you will change the way you talk, you will change from your starting point and make it more relevant to them. So I do think that flipping things around works for me and works for the communities that I work with.
And I think I'd like to add to that. So after those, you'll remember with the Extinction Rebellion protest, there was a lot of talk about this is, privilege, the white middle class people taking part in this. And, it's a very white movement and so on. There was a lot of criticism of that. And they started doing connecting communities. So they really tried to encourage people to own their own identity and be an activist in whatever way was right for them. So that I then got involved with Extinction Rebellion Psychologists, which is all about kind of, the things we've just been talking about and how we can connect as well. Very much about eco-anxiety, which has come up a lot as well. And also Christian climate action. So for me, that really aligns with my faith, but also it's kind of like indigenous faith as well. So this idea that we've lost touch, we are part of the environment's not other, it is us. And the whole world is alive and spiritual and so on. And so for me, that I found that really powerful, to kind of read more about that and see how that aligns together, and that the Western world's kind of lost, is the consumerism is a key part of the issues that we're facing. And also I saw a comment in the chat saying, like, don't all environmentalists need to become activists? For me, yes. I don't understand anymore people who can know these facts, logically talk about them, and not be pushing at every single level possible to do something, because we're in really serious stuff here now, and it's time that we all, we have to live this as well as just work in it as well.
It's interesting as well. So, and I'm sort of prompted to this from Simon's point as well in the chat around time off for climate strikes and things like that. And that was, I know was a discussion that was happening a lot in the 2019 big XR protests that were going on. It was really interesting. We have a lot of colleagues and we'll have a lot of delegates in the room from government organisations and there, and I know from some of the activity that was happening here, where we're based in Bristol, we've got a big DEFRA family group office here in the city centre, which is right next to one of the main protest sites outside of the City Hall here. And I know that many of the staff there were told by the management there to remove their lanyards and their identifying points as they were coming out and moving through the crowds, not necessarily for reasons of not being associated with the protest, but for their own safety, as well as kind of moving through if they were kind of seen as, the government or people who were responsible. And so it'd be really interesting to sort of think about, those people who are coming from those organisations where whether there is a direct conflict or not, with where the perception of conflict is enough to make people certainly under direct direction from the organisation to not participate or to make sure that they are incognito. What those kind of conflicts alongside might bring up as well. So I don't know if there are any sort of comments on that sort of thing as well.
Well, yeah, because I work with, again, similar to Laura, I work with a lot of faith groups, right? And again, this goes back to like the racism that we have in the world. But a lot of Muslim communities, faith groups, again, similar, if they're on the front line and doing any kind of direct activism, there's this whole thing about Islamophobia, about terrorism, about having a bomb. All of these like perceptions are created by the media. So it's very difficult for like Muslim communities like to really be on the front line of direct activism just because of the stereotyping around terrorism and Islam and Islamophobia. And that makes it really difficult. And I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know how to be. And I know we have XR Muslims that do a lot of really good work, but again, it really excludes a lot of faith groups in participating. And it would be nice if, because faith groups are so powerful, you know, religion around the world is very powerful, has a very powerful role. So it's like a part of activism is like we're excluding people that could actually start making changes.
I'd like to pick up on this point about whether all environmental professionals need to become activists, and I would agree with that. But I'd say at the same time, there's a slight danger there that, you know, when we talk about when we're going into the end game, so now we all have to focus on this, that we can then move to a situation where we say, well, it's all about the environment, the climate, and other things have to take second place. And actually, I mean, to come back to the point Zarina was making earlier, the way in which we actually will make progress on these things is by helping people to identify the solidarity between these movements, that actually all of these issues are about justice. Environmental justice, climate justice, racial justice, economic justice. And we have to help people join those dots. And that isn't necessarily so difficult to do. I mean, just because we see in the newspapers you know, this regular kind of slur about middle-class activists, it doesn't necessarily follow that caring about, for instance, climate change is necessarily a middle-class concern. So I think both Laura and Zarina have made reference to how people in marginalized communities and in people of color, people in other countries are at the front line of climate change. They, of course, certainly understand the importance of this issue, but that's also true for people in England as well. So, you know, this is something we saw particularly at the start of the pandemic. You know, one of the things I like to do in Experience is ask people about their degree of climate change concern, but also, you know, get self-reported socioeconomic status. And what we could clearly see happening, particularly at the start of the pandemic, was that people who rate themselves as lower on socioeconomic status were now starting to show greater climate concern than people, you know, so higher up this socioeconomic scale. And I think that's because it became more evident to them about their vulnerability. That, you know, when the shit hits the fan, they are the people who are going to be paying the cost. Right? And so that's one of the things that we need to make clear, that you know, that we stand together with people who are suffering racial injustice and other forms of social injustice, because ultimately that is the way in which, you know, we can actually bring people along with us, rather than kind of lecturing people and saying, this is the most important issue, everyone has to attend to this.
I'd like to respond to that as well. So 2 points in the chat as well about, and I think we've all alluded to that as well. So there's a sliding scale of activism, but it's all activism. You've got to live with what you're comfortable with. As I say, I don't consider myself to be arrestable. So instead, I might support protests and so on, which in some organisations is still a red flag. But what we've been doing, so I set up a community group in a form that is appropriate for this kind of, you know, suburban community. So we have an environmental group where we'll do litter picks and a repair cafe. We've linked with a local church and we're doing eco church. We've done a plastic reuse party pack and so on. And so it kind of links to like the sustainable development goals, which, you know, links to all the justice issues that you've talked about. And for me, therefore, it's about bringing this up in all conversations where possible and normalizing it. I've also made huge individual behaviour changes, and I know there's a big thing between societal and individual behaviour changes. But I personally feel if I'm telling people to make, you know, if I want societal changes, I have to make individual too, and I am in a position where I can do that. So then it's about talking to my friends about kind of riding a bike or not flying on holiday and these kind of things, about reducing meat. And these conversations all make a difference. It's that, so perhaps the Extinction Rebellion protests have moved the Overton window of what's possible. And then we are the vanguard action, the rear action coming in and changing what's normal in society. I hope that's the aim for my activism anyway.
Thank you very much as well.
Can I
I was just going to invite Zarina, if you wanted to, I was going to invite you to make a kind of closing comment on that, and then maybe just do a quick round of closing so that we finish on time as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Laura was saying. It was just about being aware, and I term it as conscious awareness, having that conscious awareness when we've tried to normalize having conversations around climate change. So it's not about preaching, again, going back to what Colin was saying. It's really about understanding what people's social justice issues are, helping and supporting one another, being connected to each other, and also being connected to the environment. And that's really important, especially for migrants that come to a different country, because when you talk to them, it's very much about how they're connected to their homelands, right? But they don't have that connection when they come to the UK and to Britain. They're not really connected to the earth and the natural environment in the UK. And I do a lot of work to get that connection. So really, for me, it's about being connected to one another, connected to our environment, and living with a conscious awareness. And if we all do this, I think we are all activists at heart.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We do actually have another couple of minutes. So what I might just do is ask everyone to just do a quick closing remark, maybe on either anything that you've seen sort of just coming up in this last bit of chat as well. Lots and lots of activity going on in there. But think about if there's sort of one thing that you would want to see from from the environmental sector going forwards in an activism light, what would it be? So if I start with Laura, maybe on that one.
Yeah. So individual versus social action, maybe. We need both. I know we hear that. But how can we be communicating about these issues if we're not living it too? So for me, make the individual changes that you can, talk about them to others. There's a great project, 26,000 climate conversations. So kind of, sharing that awareness in everyday life. And then pushing back against political community lobbying discussions in what's available to you in your spare time and capabilities and so on as well. So yeah, I really think we need to be living this at this point in time.
Thanks, Laura. And then if we come to Colin, and then Zarina, we'll finish with you.
Well, I really agree with this point that Zarina was making earlier about how important it is that at least you do something, and I think we should all be happy to think of ourselves as activists in whatever we do. And we shouldn't try to have some kind of hierarchy where people who are willing to get arrested or go to prison are somehow better activists. It's all about people doing whatever they can. And of course, we don't know what works. Right? None of us actually know the solution to this. So it's important that we experiment and we try out different things, and that we reflect on those experiments and think, okay, well, how well did that work? And how will I ultimately be able to have the biggest impact possible? But in doing that, I really encourage people to be bold and don't allow yourself to be hemmed in by the straitjacket of professionalism, because there's lots of great things about being a professional, but also it is something that has a very clear constraint on people. People know what the rules are, even though they're not written down. Sometimes it's good to fight against those rules.
Thank you, Colin. And Zarina, any last thoughts?
Yeah, just a very quick one. It's just again thinking about being consciously aware of what we do, what we buy, how we live, and simply moving from the ego to the eco is what I would see.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. Lots of inspiration there. Clearly lots more to be done within our organisations to push some of these things and push against some of these challenges that we're seeing come out in the chat. Thank you, and thank you all in the panel, and thank you everyone for joining. We'll be moving over to the stage area now for our closing part of the session, where we'll be reflecting on some of the sessions that you might have missed, and you can join me and Savita there in a couple of minutes. So thank you very much. Thanks to our panel again, and I hope you've had a great time taking part.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.